I'm Thomas Lloyd, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Mellon Curricula lecture, produced by the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art in conjunction with the Wethersfield House and Gardens. Today's speaker is Mitch Owens, who will speak to you about the rich history of this storied estate. Please enjoy today's program, and I encourage you to visit the Wethersfield Gardens and House.
I'm so glad you all are here. I was just thinking how most lectures are frightening, but this is like being with my family, because I know that we all love the same things, but we also all realize that we're looking at a house, a garden, a person, the designers, everything. It's this holistic experience that you're unable to separate one from the other, and especially so at Wethersfield, which I think after all this time, I still think Mr. Stillman's going to walk around a corner and either tell me not to touch that or sit down and actually talk about it. I think he was someone who, he deeply loved his house, he deeply loved the land around it, and he lived his life in this, his family, his interests. So I wanted to first thank everyone at Wethersfield for helping me and asking me to do this. Toshiano, who you've all met, the director of horticulture, who would probably do this much better than I, and executive director Tara Schaefer, Mr. Stillman's granddaughter, who's been hugely generous and enormously patient. The first time I came here, I had my 5-year-old with me, and she ran all over this house, and I think ended up on Mr. Stillman's bed at one point. And Tara didn't bat an eye. It was great fun. And I wanted to say also thank you to the ICAA, Peter Leyden, everyone at the ICAA. It's wonderful to be part of your family. And I wanted to point out that not only is this a Stillman day, wall to wall, outside and inside, even our luncheon will have a Stillman touch, being adapted from Tara's grandfather's own preferences to what he served. Are there Fritos? We didn't see any Fritos? Okay. We were talking about that Fritos were a huge thing for him. So to go on, how to begin? There are so many facets to Chauncey Devereux Stillman, a name I cannot say without thinking of Edith Wharton novels, as indicated by these photographs of him from his youth to his senior years. He was a deeply fascinating individual, a banking heir, a philanthropist, a graduate of Harvard and Columbia, a conservationist, a commodore of the New York Yacht Club, an equestrian, a collector of art, as well as historic carriages, a cradle Episcopalian who converted to Roman Catholicism in middle age, a devotee of fox hunting, a squadron air combat intelligence officer during World War II, a staff officer with the National Security Council and the director of a mining company. I think we could talk to him about practically anything. Long before it became fashionable to go back to the land, Mr. Stillman, and we always call him Mr. Stillman, like Mr. Jefferson, championed agricultural issues with an emphasis on biodiversity, proselytizing for the new agrarian movement of the 1930s, and even funding and serving as a founding editor of the monthly magazine Free America, an agrarian-founded publication whose manifesto was, "Free America stands for individual independence and believes that freedom can exist only in societies in which the great majority are the effective owners of tangible and productive property, and in which group action is democratic," with a lowercase d. Originally from Connecticut, the Stillman family found fertile ground in Brownsville, Texas, which Mr. Stillman's great-grandfather, Charles Stillman, a swashbuckler with robber baron tendencies, founded in 1851, and where he launched the family fortune by investing in riverboats, cotton broking, textile manufacturing, real estate, and Mexican silver mines. Chauncey's industrialist grandfather, James Stillman, on the right, magnified the millions through numerous businesses, but most importantly, through his control of National City Bank in New York City, once called the greatest bank in the Western Hemisphere, and saw his family allied through business and marriage with, among others, the Rockefellers. James also owned one of Manhattan's grandest residences, a French Renaissance-style palace by Carrere and Hastings, which he purchased in 1901, 6 years before grandson Chauncey's birth. James Stillman was also an important art collector, acquiring such masterworks as Francesco Francia's St. Barbara, Lorenzo di Credi's Portrait of a Gentleman, and a portrait of a young girl by his great friend Mary Cassatt. The family's hallmark possession, though, was Pontormo's 1530 Portrait of a Halberdier, which is now a prize of California's Getty Museum. Mr. Stillman shared it with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and when it was in his possession, he would display it in his Manhattan apartment, shown at right, and take it with him to Wethersfield each summer. That, if you love a work of art, you have to pack it. Thank God it wasn't a sculpture, it's just a painting. You can put it under your arm. That family connoisseurship was carried forward by Mr. Stillman over his long and eventful life, his own purchases, including a portrait of a boy that was one of Toulouse-Lautrec's last works, a genre work by 18th century French master Nicolas Lancret, a John Singer Sargent portrait, and one of his own personal prizes, a Gilbert Stuart of George Washington. In 1939, Chauncey married Theodora Morgan Jay, a granddaughter of Edwin Dennison Morgan, one of McKim, Mead & White's most important private clients. For Morgan, the firm designed the great Long Island estate known as Westerly, and it was at Westerly's private chapel that the couple's nuptials were held. You can see that on the left and below. It's been turned into a house and recently sold, as I recall. 2 years before the wedding, though, Mr. Stillman had been riding in the Millbrook Hunt, as we heard earlier from Toshi, and fell in love with the countryside. And putting his money where his mouth was, i.e. Free America, he purchased 2 adjoining farms and began to plan an agrarian paradise that he called Wethersfield after his great-grandfather's birthplace in Connecticut. Do you remember our riding over the hills in search of the appropriate site for the house when you broke the news that you wanted me to serve as your architect, at which instant I literally fell off my horse? So wrote architect Bansal Lafarge, shown at left, in a letter to Stillman in 1974. A grandson of the great American artist John Lafarge, Bansal at left was like Stillman in his 30s. So was Lafarge's business partner, Alexander Knox, at right. Despite their reputation in the middle of the 20th century, neither man much rings a bell in architectural circles today, though Lafarge, like Stillman, was a classicist, best known aesthetically for his design of the barn and the guest house at Middleton Place in South Carolina. During the Second World War, though, Lafarge served as one of the leading members of the so-called monuments men, the individuals, as Toshi pointed out, saved and returned Nazi-looted works of art. For Stillman, Lafarge would create what the client would later describe as a simple Georgian colonial house, fashioned of red brick and accented with a brownstone Greek Revival porch. The stone also inspired the toning of the shutters and other aspects of the house. The effect was streamlined and unmistakably a design of the mid-20th century, though grounded in precedent. The layout spoke of a single central block, pulled here and pushed there, as if it was sort of a chest of drawers. It had been added onto over time, drawers pulled out here and there. To the left are the service wing, as we saw outside. These photographs were taken in 1944, the black and whites, after Mr. Stillman returned from World War II. It was also the year of the birth of their first child. Here is the layout of the house just from the second floor. As you can see how it's all sort of pulled and pushed and symmetrical, but in a mirror fashion. Each of the bedrooms, which I find hugely charming and still is intact today, the bedrooms were given their own decorative theme and corresponding name: bamboo, strawberry, aqua, lavender, and goldfish. Though this floor is presently closed to us, during a recent photo shoot with Peter Esterson for the November issue of the World of Interiors, we did photograph the Tate and Hall decorated bamboo bedroom, which remains remarkably the same as it did in 1944. Here are some additional views taken of the rear of Wethersfield House in 1944 by Gottscho to show how it clusters village-like on its hill, the highest spot in Dutchess County, I'm told. Someone can kick me if I'm wrong. And before the gardens, initially begun by landscape designer Brian Lynch, were taken in hand in the 1950s by Evelyn Poehler. At the lower left is a folly-like tool shed, while at the right is the pergolid terrace that leads off the dining room and connects off to the side with that tool shed. Here it's important to point out, for me at least, that I think Wethersfield is Lafarge and Knox's finest creation. Most of the firm's other houses tended to be Georgian colonial norm, in particular the sort of central block with flankers, such as Virginia's Mount Sharon Farm, completed about the same time as Wethersfield. This Dutchess County success was because Mr. Stillman was virtually a third aesthetic partner in the project, having an advanced architecture degree from Columbia. This is another group of Gottscho images taken in 1944. On the southern facade, the tripartite window at the center, tapped with a blind fan light to make it appear Palladian from the exterior, marks Mr. Stillman's bedroom. There's a bathroom window at the left and his dressing room window at the right. Though Stillman called his house simple and Georgian colonial, architects Lafarge and Knox enlivened the structure with a Regency-inspired, as we saw, ironwork. At the center was that double-decker veranda that Mr. Stillman called the pagoda for obvious reasons, and worked into the ironwork, which Lafarge designed, are sheaves of wheat symbolizing Wethersfield's agrarian purpose. It was a country estate, an escape from Manhattan, but it was also a working farm. This is Mr. Stillman's bedroom, done in sort of George Washington mode, and you can see that the ceiling is not really high enough for what appears to be a Palladian window on the facade. And here again is the pagoda, which I think is one of the most delightful aspects of Wethersfield, because if you shorn all of that away, it would be a very severe red brick house. It looks very much of its time, a colonial revival house of the late 1930s, early 1940s, sort of shorn of all unessential detail. But then when you get around the back, suddenly you see this incredibly fanciful double veranda, sort of like out of a Georgette Heyer novel. And these lovely box windows, one to the dining room and one sort of in that hall that remind me of Regency shop fronts. Wethersfield, here's another view of the pagoda as seen from the herb garden, as we saw today with that lovely circular stairs taken from Lutyens. And I love that too, that the narrative of Wethersfield, the Georgian revival, the bit of Greek revival, the bit of Regency revival. Suddenly there's an arts and crafts garden off to the one side, started that way, and then suddenly in the 1950s, it's developed into this Italian Renaissance landscape. Wethersfield's interiors were initially the work of Diane Tate and Marion Hall, a team of Manhattan society decorators known for their period work, largely English and French. At Wethersfield, though, a more contemporary 1940s feeling was originally at play on the main floor, with antiques and fine art, some things traditional, some things contemporary, mingled in a way that managed to feel luxurious and spare at the same time. At right is the gallery that leads from the entrance hall to the drawing room where we're seated, an airy passage hung with modern tufted curtains, and a colorful carpet made in New England, and a reproduction Italian directoire chair that Tate and Hall purchased from the shop of another important decorator of the time, Ruby Ross Wood. Lafarge and Knox paneled the space we're in, the drawing room, with the sparest of pine paneling, parched and finished, decidedly not 18th century in effect. It was more originally like a cigar box, very plain, only lightly detailed. It was, however, period, recycled from a Vermont courthouse that was being dismantled. Above the Tate and Hall sofa hangs the Pontormo portrait of the halberdier, and bronze heads of Stillman and his wife, hers by Antonia Salem, was positioned on that a little round table, pedestal table in front of the library door. The library at that time was not, as I recall, finished, but it would be within 2 or 3 years. The dining room was equally streamlined, hinting at the past while most definitely declaring itself to be of the present. On the wall opposite the box window, Lafarge and Knox carved out a shallow niche that echoed the window, itself providing an opportunity to present another garden, a different garden, this one being an exotic wallpaper landscape that corresponded to the formal landscape that was being developed outside. The library, as I said, completed only after World War II and located behind the drawing room, was painted what Mr. Stillman called blueprint blue. And it was dominated by a set of supposed carvings by Grinland Gibbings that were from Hamilton Palace in Scotland and added at that time. Mr. Stillman initially rejected the carvings as being entirely too big for the room, but Lafarge argued that they could be assembled, so he had the whole thing taken apart and put back together and edited out so it would actually just touch the ceiling. And when Mr. Stillman saw it, apparently, Lafarge looked at him and said, "See, I even made the blossoms wilt." As I said earlier, though Wethersfield affects a colonial countenance, numerous 1940s details are woven into the architecture. I noticed Martha Stewart photographing that lovely alabaster shell sconce, which Mr. Stillman brought back a set of them from a trip to Italy. On the left is one of several rope twists, moldings you can see throughout the house that make me think very much that Mr. Stillman was keeping in mind his time as Commodore of the New York Yacht Club. There are lots of echoes to his personality, his life, his interests in this house, almost more than any house I've ever seen. Every place you look is either something he enjoyed doing, sailing, something he enjoyed investing in, art, something he enjoyed commissioning, architecture. It's just this constant presence of him. And on the far right is another one of my favorite details of Wethersfield, of the valances designed in the shape of inverted lotus blossoms. And I find that recessed lighting panel pretty wonderful. And it gives, in the evening, when I was here the first time, and Toshi turned on the lights, they're like little shadow boxes when you walk down the hall to the dining room. Throughout the 1970s, Mr. Stillman relied on another architect, Fred Poehler, Evelyn Poehler's husband, to make various improvements to the house and to the gardens through statuary as well as architectural details. In the drawing room, this meant laying narrow strips of gilded wood to frame the room, while also innovatively flanking the windows in pilasters that appear to be ionic columns sliced in half. Mr. Stillman's original architect, Lafarge, dismissed that idea back in 1939, calling the concept too Londony. But Mr. Stillman finally got Polar to return to the idea and install it. Lafarge's staircase features lotus-like details as well. And William Delano of the New York architecture firm Delano & Aldrich suggested the unusual circular brass grips that allow one to descend relatively safely from the elevated entrance hall to the gallery. The Gott show photographs show no handrail at all, so I'm very happy that these were brought in. In the 1970s, found Stillman commissioning several fanciful improvements to the house. I wanted to make an emphasis at one point. This is a post-1950, let's say 51. Wethersfield starts to go through a number of aesthetic changes, improvements, enrichments, deepening the house, which was already filled with lots of family memorabilia from both Mr. Stillman's family as well as his wife's family. He and Mrs. Stillman divorced in 1949, and 2 years later, Mr. Stillman converted to Roman Catholicism, something he said he had been thinking about since childhood. For me, as let's say a semi-amateur art historian, architectural historian, Wethersfield changes at that very moment in time. Before, it feels like a very, may I say it, an Episcopalian house. It has a clarity, it has a simplicity, it's the Book of Common Prayer in red brick and brownstone. At this moment in 1951 is when you start to see the gardens change. You start to see him not only turning his faith toward Rome, but his aesthetic eye toward Rome, to Italy. And I find that especially entrancing about this house, because there is no house that can be discussed or understood without understanding as deeply as humanly possible the person who lived in it, for good or for ill. And I think this change in his life makes Wethersfield a house that keeps, it's this layer, it's this onion. You keep peeling it away and you're never going to get to the core. Because although he left papers, many papers, I've not been able to stumble across certain aspects, certain documents that would clear up a riddle here or a riddle there. But as I said, he started commissioning, as you saw, the garden, this extraordinary Italian Renaissance garden with this very intellectualization of the landscape through mythology, through Roman literature. And one of the things that he installed or commissioned in the 1970s is that this wonderful little trompe-l'oeil flower room, which he had painted by an artist friend, Hype Moore, in the 1970s. It had previously been an absolutely utilitarian space, but Moore had it painted in an evocation of a villa in the Brenta. As for the tool shed in the garden, known as the Grasshopper House, because of its grasshopper finial, which Mr. Stillman found in Nantucket, Hype Moore created these transporting confectionery murals incorporating personal references to Stillman, his family, their hobbies, their pets. The design was based on a room at Italy's Stupinghi hunting lodge, namely the Sala della Prospettivo, which Stillman had seen in a tiny photograph in a French magazine and brought to Hype Moore's attention and said, can you do something like this in a tiny little space? Which he did beautifully, I think. And it's such a magical space here at Wethersfield. The most important artistic contributor to Wethersfield, however, was the Italian painter Pietro Anigoni, shown here in a self-portrait at left, as well as at work in his studio in Florence. Anigoni's seminal work remains the hugely popular portrait of the garter-robed young Queen Elizabeth, whom he described to Stillman in a letter as a charming lady but a restless model. He also painted portraits of Prince Philip on the left and Princess Margaret on the right, along with millions of other celebrities. That's what he was hugely known for in the 50s and 60s. Chauncey Stillman met Anigoni first in the 1950s when the artist had a solo exhibition in New York City. And soon after, in 1962, he commissioned Anigoni to put his daughters, Theo and Lily, to canvas, two notably charming and successful works. As Stillman recalled, he was just on his way from drawing the Time magazine cover portrait of President Kennedy and returning to Florence. I asked him to paint my daughters, and he rather vaguely said, well, sometime. I did not hear from him for 2 years. Stillman was surprised that when it did happen, one daughter appeared to be wearing makeup, whilst the other was bare of cosmetics. When he asked Anigoni about it, saying, why did you paint Lily without lipstick and no jewelry, and Theo with lipstick and pearl earrings? And Anigoni said, that's simple. Lily obeyed me, Thea didn't. Anigoni, though, the dog, that's what it was. One of his daughters, which one is it with the dog? Snoopy the Beagle is there, which I think was really quite lovely. He was supposed to have painted some other animal, and the subject protested and brought the dog in, and he said, fine, we'll paint the dog. Anigoni, however, was more inspired by and following in the footsteps of Michelangelo, and was much more interested in the art of fresco, his most famous being this extraordinary mural for the monastery of Monte Cassino. In the mid-1960s, Stillman, aware of this passion, asked Anigoni to create his first American fresco, fueled by wine from Stillman's cellar and serenaded by Vivaldi's The Four Seasons on a turntable. Anigoni and his young apprentice, Antonio Ciccone, here at left in a self-portrait, executed the very first American fresco, Anigoni's first large-scale work. Here you see it in Wethersfield dining room in 1963, a wall-spanning pastoral scene framed by fluttering trompe-l'oeil curtains as if somebody has just flung them open, which is a really wonderful sense of movement. Stillman recalled that he and his daughters and Anigoni and his butler and great friend Eddie Newman were having a picnic in 1962. I remember the late sunlight or afterglow seen through the hemlocks and the blue smoke from roasting sausages or whatever was rising in the air, and the charming young people, I think in bathing suits or whatever, and saying to Anigoni, I wish you'd paint this charming scene. Come back next summer and do it. So we spent all of October 1963 painting the fresco on the west wall of the dining room. The scenery, though Italian in aspect, was inspired by Wethersfield's own natural setting, whilst the models came from Anigoni's memory of sitters in Italy. I had surmised, Mr. Stillman wrote, it would be a historical record or a family conversation piece showing all of this, but it didn't turn out that way. Snoopy the Beagle was the only actual character of ours that got into it. Anigoni would go on to paint a variety. Oh, here are some details of that same mural showing the models. It's a really beautiful pastoral scene. Anigoni would paint a variety of works for Wethersfield over the years, including the rondels inset over several doors, as well as a mysterious and rather wonderful landscape called Dream Fugue behind this screen. But you can see here on the right for the drawing room, which Mr. Stillman had ingeniously tilted to reduce the glare on its varnished surface from the windows on the opposite wall. Stillman noted that the view was also inspired by Wethersfield's own landscape, saying in the background one can see the cedar alley that leads up to the Naiad Fountain in our outer garden. In the upper right-hand corner is a glimpse of the round Belvedere or Tempietto at the northeast end of our garden. The figures are all out of his imagination, as is that mess of foliage. When I asked him to paint a blue painting, he said, I will, but you'll have to redecorate the room because your blue upholstery is too timid. So we have inserted a lot of brighter blues. At the end of the 1960s, Stillman decided to attach an orangerie to Wethersfield House. Architecturally, he looked to Samuel Wyatt, namely the orangerie at Heveningham House. "Why can't we be so bold as Wyatt," he wrote to Polar, "and have the arched windows rise straight up to the architrave?" It is worth remembering, as I said, that Stillman was not only an exacting client, he was a trained client. So he knew what he was talking about. So he and his architectural team could speak on equal footing. In any event, the arched windows were not brought up to the level he thought daring enough. On the left is the eastern wall of the orangerie, which was soon adapted into an enclosed space. At the right you see that attached to the main entrance. Initially, the idea was to have this open orangerie where Stillman could take a table, work if he liked. There would be a skylight, which was a plastic skylight above, and these so it'd be open out to the garden. But very soon, it was quickly, I mean, within weeks, it was decided to do something entirely different. And here you see Polar's approved version of the gloriette, which with the cut glass chandeliers, as well as you don't see the plastic skylight, but it was indeed there. And there you see on the center of the north wall, the fountain, which has its echo out in the garden, as Toshi pointed out. And here is Polar's design for the floor, composed of travertine and black and white Italian marbles. At this point, Stillman corresponded with Anigoni and suggested somewhat jokingly that the gloriette could be sort of a Sistine Chapel for the artist, who mirthfully dubbed the space the Osteria del Palladio. Encouraged to study a reproduction of a pulchritudinous Jean-Dominique Ingres harem scene, the artist fired off sketches for approval. Mr. Stillman was taken aback by the resultant bare bums and rotund breasts that his daughter Theo described as a masterpiece of eroticism. Well, here you see part of the gloriette with some of the bare figures at one end of the vault. My own daughter, Gemma, age 5, was frankly puzzled on our visit and stared at the ceiling in wonder and said very loudly, "Why is everybody naked?" Men and women slumber, dance, romance, play instruments beneath a clouded sky, threaded with skeletal trees, all illuminated by hidden cold cathode lighting. "Theo and I think it might be a little too nude," Mr. Stillman carefully responded in a remembrance tucked in Wethersfield's fascinating archives. "Could we have a little less Ang and a little more Pontormo or Michelangelo?" Anigoni did not even respond. Like Michelangelo dealing with the Pope, he did as he liked. Completed in 1972 at a cost of $263,000 and set aglow with this lighting, the fresco, with 3 others marching down one wall, would be recorded in a privately printed book. Therein, the master of Wethersfield explained that the acres of roseate flesh represent an age of innocence, where man is in harmony with his world, the remote heritage that all races hold in common: Eden, Arcady, paradise, the peaceable kingdom. Given that no official pictorial theme had apparently been discussed, Anigoni called it a wise interpretation. The project was not without its hiccups, however. Special scaffolding had to be ordered, since Anigoni weighs, at my guess, more than 200 pounds, Stillman advised one of his staffers. The artist successfully argued that the room needed neither the plastic skylight nor the cut glass chandeliers, so those were excised. Anigoni then worried if the American gypsum plaster would perform as well as traditional Italian lime plaster. It did. He and his assistants would stay off and on at Wethersfield for about a year to complete the commission, during which debilitating bronchitis nearly sent the artist to his sickbed. As for Stillman, he fretted that the team's visits never coincided with his world at its most alluring. "I wish you were at Wethersfield right now in the first flush of summer, decked with peonies and roses and still vernal freshness fair, as a bride adorned for the bridegroom, he wrote. You always see the place drowsy with late summer, rouged with autumn, like some grand seedy old tragedy queen. Still, Anigoni's frescoes sensitively echoed the landscape seen through the gloriette's windows. The painted hills could be Italy or Dutchess County, whichever you wish, Mr. Stillman told a visitor, allowing, however, that the plant life that sprouted from Anigoni's brush would not stand up to botanical scrutiny. Not all the imagery is from the artist's hand. However, Mr. Stillman was allowed to paint some of the fruit in the bowl. The bowl right there. He was allowed to paint the fruit in the bowl that's being proffered by the curvaceous maiden. One can hardly imagine Michelangelo handing a brush to Pope Julius and saying, just go for it. Whilst Rosella Segreto, Anigoni's fashion model girlfriend and future wife, painted the Canadian geese flying overhead. Her beloved artist incorporated her into one of the 3 wall frescoes, a wide-eyed beauty emerging from a woodland thicket, wearing, of all things, a fur-trimmed Dior gown. Stillman himself was also worked in the frescoes, pictured in a hunting scene. Anigoni's assistant had included the portrait of Stillman here. It was a portrait that Anigoni had originally painted, a reverse image of it, and everybody hated the original portrait, and they called it the Dying Commodore, because it was painted at a very cold day, and they were sitting out on the terrace that links the dining room to the grasshopper house. And apparently it got getting colder and colder and colder, and Mr. Stillman would not move inside, but kept getting grayer and grayer and more blue. And all of this you can read about in the November issue of the World of Interiors, a hint of which is shown here. I think bravely retardé and deliriously chic, Wethersfield's Gloriette is a far cry from the Sistine Chapel, but it's a lot more fun. Thank you very much.